Genghis Khan's wrath on Nishapur, 1221 Persia. So, here's the setup. Genghis Khan's son-in-law, Tokhchar, was leading the Mongol forces in Nishapur to do the regular raiding and terrorism of ancient times. Everything seemed fine until the city folks decided that they had absolutely had it with these invaders. In an act of defiance, they killed Tokhchar with a lucky shot to the head during a skirmish. Big mistake. Big. Think poking a dragon with a toothpick levels of big. You see, Tokhchar wasn't just any soldier, he was married to Genghis Khan's daughter, and this guy had earned his way into the Khan family, a feat more difficult than assembling IKEA furniture without the manual. When the news of his death reached Genghis Khan's daughter, she didn't cry into her goat milk, she demanded revenge. But not just any revenge, but a biblical-level massacre. And, well, if you're familiar with history, you'll know that when Genghis Khan promised to take care of business, he didn't do things halfway. He first sent an army led by his other son, Tului, to Nishapur with one mission: leave no survivors. First, the Mongols stormed the city like a Black Friday sale gone berserk. They tore through Nishapur's defenses, captured it, and rounded up the population. Every man, woman, child, dog, cat, and possibly pet hamster was executed. Tului reportedly left no breathing things behind. This wasn't just revenge, it was extermination. Historians estimate that 1.7 million people may have been killed. Let's pause to digest that. 1.7 million. That's not a body count, it's a population collapse. And it didn't stop there, because after this brutal massacre, the Mongols burned the city to the ground. Buildings gone. Culture destroyed. It was as if Nishapur had never existed. Genghis Khan didn't just conquer, he made sure his enemies knew the price of messing with his family. Nishapur's fate was meant to be a message to the world. You kill one of ours, and we'll obliterate you from history itself. Queen Anula's Poison Party. 1st century BCE, Sri Lanka. Picture this. You are an ancient peasant in Sri Lanka, 1st century BCE, and during the day, the town crier comes around to announce that Queen Anula will be holding a royal feast. Everyone was excited, but little did you know that this feast was not your regular, but literally the last supper for anyone who partook. You see, Anula was a trailblazer in toxic relationships, literally. She was first married to King Choranaga, who wasn't exactly the poster boy for loving husbands, and the minute Anula suspected betrayal, rather than write an angry diary or send passive-aggressive papyrus notes, Anula went nuclear. When Choranaga mysteriously dropped dead after a meal, people side-eyed Anula harder than a cat next to a shattered vase. But she wasn't done. Oh no. The poison had only just started to flow. Once Naga was out of the way, she started the process of getting married to another king, and that one too mysteriously dropped dead after a meal. In fact, this exact same pattern happened with 5 more husbands. She was basically just poisoning these guys like it was her royal hobby. Now, you'd think her insatiable taste for feeding people cyanide would end here, right? Well, no. Because anyone who crossed her or looked at her wrong met the same fate. Servants, poisoned. Rivals, poisoned. A random court jester who made a bad joke, poisoned. It wasn't just personal revenge anymore. It was like she had a Costco-sized jar of cyanide and a grudge against humanity. But here's the kicker. Anula wanted to cement her legacy as Sri Lanka's deadliest queen, so she declared herself sole ruler and kept moving on her poison spree. But soon, karma came knocking, because after years of ruling with a chalice of death, the people finally had enough. She was overthrown by a man named Kutakana Tissa, and her end was as fiery as her personality. They set her on fire. Yep, no antidote for that one. Her reign of terror ended in a blaze. Talk about going out with a bang or a sizzle. Olga of Kiev's ruthless retaliation, 10th century. Imagine you're living in the 10th century and married to the love of your life, who is literally almost the most powerful man in that era. However, one day he goes on his monthly travels to collect tribute from the neighboring village, only for them to murder him in the most inhumane way possible. That sounds like something you'd want to seek revenge for, right? Well, Olga, the wife of Igor Kiev, Kyiv did it in the most epic way possible. In fact, if revenge were an Olympic sport, Olga would take home the gold, silver, and bronze, and probably steal everyone else's medals just for good measure. Basically, after the people of Drevlians murdered Igor by tying his legs to two bent birch trees and letting physics do its horrifying thing, they even had the audacity to think they could marry Olga and gain control of Kyiv. Talk about misreading the room and rubbing pepper on a bleeding, gaping wound. First off, they sent 20 suitors to propose marriage, and she carried them in their boats to Kyiv and just ordered her guards to drop them alive into the trench, where they were essentially buried in mud. She then invited another group of 30 Drevlian bigwigs to Kyiv and offered them a feast and the luxury of a bathhouse. But as soon as they went in to bathe, she locked the house and set them on fire. Talk about a sauna of death. Next, she headed to the Drevian capital and suggested a truce on the condition that they throw her a feast and wait till they got drunk to a stupor. This lady then asked her guards to slaughter all 5,000 of them right there and then. Now this is where Olga's creativity soared, literally, because for the grand finale she demanded 3 pigeons and 3 sparrows from each Drevlian household as a peace offering. The Drevlians, probably thinking this was the weirdest tax ever, complied. Olga then tied sulfur and cloth to the birds, set them on fire, and let them fly back to their nests, which were obviously in the Drevlian kingdom. The whole city went up in flames, with all its residents running and burning in horror. This woman turned every insult into a lesson in why you shouldn't cross a queen, literally or figuratively, and believe it or not, Olga was later canonized as a saint in the Orthodox Church. The blood feud of the Hatfields and McCoys, 1860s to 1890s USA. Picture this: you're at a barbecue, the ribs are falling off the bone, the whiskey's flowing, and everyone's having a good time until your cousin accuses someone from the other side of the party of stealing their pig. A pig! The next thing you know, the backyard bash turns into the Wild West with bullets flying and people hollering and shouting like mad bulls. Sounds absurd, right? But this silly accusation would spark a decade-long grudge where insults and injuries got passed down like family recipes. The feud kicked off in the 1860s when Asa Harmon McCoy, a Union soldier, was allegedly killed by the Hatfields. But things really got saucy over a hog in 1878 when Randolph McCoy claimed the Hatfields had pignapped one of his prized porkers, which back then was akin to stealing someone's Wi-Fi password today. A declaration of war! The Hatfields argued the pig was theirs, and after a lot of back and forth, the trial ended in favor of the Hatfields. But, well, the McCoys were filled with rage and didn't let it go at all. To add pepper to an already gaping wound, Rosanna McCoy fell for Yonsa Hatfield. But when she got pregnant, Yonsa ditched her faster than a ghosted text and married another woman. Well, the Hatfields, led by Devil Anse Hatfield, yes, that was his real name, decided to burn down the McCoy cabin on New Year's Day. They killed 2 McCoy children and beat Randolph McCoy's wife within an inch of her life. In an act of retaliation, 3 McCoys stabbed and shot a bunch of Hatfields in a drunken brawl. Talk about a resolution to keep things heated. Not one to take an insult like that, the Hatfields captured some McCoys, brutally tortured and killed them, and then sent the bodies back as a message. Forget passive-aggressive text chains, these folks went full-blown medieval. Over 12 years, more than 24 people were killed, and many more were wounded. In fact, the feud became so notorious that the governors of Kentucky and West Virginia almost went to war themselves, prompting the Supreme Court to step in. That's right, the Supreme Court had to mediate a family squabble. And in 2003, the Hatfields and McCoys officially signed a truce. Because nothing says bygones be bygones like a century-long cooling-off period. The Bath School Disaster, 1927. Imagine you're sitting in your elementary school class in 1927 listening to your teacher drone on about multiplication tables when your peaceful day suddenly goes boom. And not because someone farted too loud in the back of the class, but because some mad farmer was pissed about taxes. The mad farmer in question was a man named Andrew Kehoe, who was also a school board treasurer and a man with a serious vendetta against the world, especially with taxes. He was convinced that the taxes levied to fund the Bath Consolidated School in Michigan had ruined him financially, though in reality, his debt troubles were more about his bad decisions than property taxes. So, in some kind of twisted sick revenge against the board, he decided to blow up the school and his farm. The worst part is that he didn't just wake up one morning and decide to do this. No, he planned this like it was the World Series of revenge. For months, Kehoe covertly packed the schools with over 500 pounds of explosives, dynamite and pyritol, a surplus material from World War I. He then booby-trapped his own farm, rigging it to explode so he could take as much of his world with him as possible. Imagine being mad at the government for taxing you and deciding to commit mass murder as revenge. On kids, for that matter. What happened to passive-aggressive letters to the tax board? Sadly, on that fateful morning, Kehoe first set his farm on fire as a distraction. Then, at 8:45 a.m., the school exploded. The north wing of the Bath Consolidated School was obliterated, killing 38 children and 6 adults, with dozens more injured. And here's the jaw-dropping part: half of the explosives failed to detonate. So that means if they had gone off, the entire school would have been reduced to rubble. And as if that wasn't chaos enough, Kehoe drove his truck that was packed with even more explosives into the chaotic scene, waved cheerily at the school superintendent, and detonated it. Talk about a dramatic mic drop. This final explosion killed Kehoe, the superintendent, and several others. The story of Phulan Devi. Now, Phulan Devi, an Indian woman born in the 1980s, came from a low-caste family in a small village in Uttar Pradesh, where life dealt her every bad card possible. Think of it as the world's worst poker game: poverty, child marriage, and abuse. By 11 years old, she was already married off to a much older man who treated her horribly. When she eventually escaped his clutches, society still wasn't ready to hand her a "You Go Girl" trophy. Instead, she was rejected and ostracized from her community because apparently running away from your husband's house, even though he beat you like an ox, was still an abomination. The story gets worse because some bandits kidnapped poor Phulan from the Bemai village. These guys were led by a thug named Thakur Sri Ram, and they raped, tortured, and did all sorts of depraved acts on her. The plan was to break her spirit, but instead, they lit the match for one of the most infamous acts of revenge in Indian history. Fast forward to 1981. Phulan, now the leader of her own gang, returned to Bemai with one goal: payback. She marched into the village like a one-woman storm and ordered her gang to round up every man who had been a part of her suffering. And then, in a move that shocked the nation, she lined up 22 men and had them executed. Now, you might be thinking, well, that escalated quickly, and you'd be right. It was extreme, brutal, and unapologetically hardcore. Imagine the Wild West, but swap out Clint Eastwood for an avenging woman in a sari. The massacre not only made headlines, but also sent a clear message. Phulan wasn't here to play nice. Well, this act put her on the police radar, but for 2 years, Phulan evaded the police, surviving in ravines, outsmarting law enforcement, and continuing her Robin Hood-type reign. However, she finally surrendered in 1983, and after spending a decade in jail, Phulan later reinvented herself as a politician and became a member of parliament. Yes, the bandit queen became the ballot queen. She advocated for women's rights and caste equality. The Boston Tea Party, 1773. Imagine you're at your favorite cafe sipping a perfectly brewed cup of tea, but when the barista slides you the bill, instead of $5, it's $20 because the government decided they really like tea taxes. You complain, but the barista smirks and tells you to take it up with King George III because he set the rules. Now, would you politely pay and walk away, stage a peaceful protest, or dress up like a raccoon and throw the cafe's entire tea stash into the nearest river? Well, colonists in 1773 Boston went with option 3, and it was a really funny story of vengeance. You see, back in the 1770s, Britain was acting like that one friend who ate your fries and then asked you to Venmo them for the shared experience. After the costly French and Indian War, the British Parliament decided the American colonies should pay their fair fair share through a series of taxes, like the Sugar Act and Stamp Act. But it was the Tea Act of 1773 that really brewed trouble. The act wasn't even about raising new taxes, it just gave the British East India Company, which was basically the Amazon of tea, a monopoly on selling tea in the colonies. While the tea prices were technically lower, colonists saw this as a sneaky way to make them accept taxation without representation. So a group called the Sons of Liberty decided to hit the British where it hurt. Their mission was basically to dump tea worth about $1.7 million in today's money into Boston Harbor. But it gets crazier because these rebels disguised themselves as Mohawk Native Americans wearing colorful feathers so they could confuse the British. Some even dressed up in raccoon costumes. And on the night of December 16th, 1773, the Sons of Liberty, armed with axes and plenty of sass, went to work. They smashed open 342 chests of tea for over 3 hours and dumped it into Boston Harbor. That's practically 90,000 pounds of tea, enough for 24 million cups of tea. This was honestly a crime that would make any British grandma faint on sight. This wasn't just about dumping tea, though. It was a symbolic act of defiance that showed that the colonists were not going to let their freedom be messed with, no matter what.